morning. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us. You missed us. We were telling a story that your Destiny of the Republic book was so good and such an unknown story that was lost to history.
Thank you.
That when this book came out, we said, well, she's got to have found another great story. So another story, the book is called Hero of the Empire, The Boer War, A Daring Escape and the Making of Winston Churchill. Candice, I imagine this is another story that was sort of lost to history?
Yeah, it was. I think it's largely because Churchill was so young at the time. He was 24 years old. So it's actually what launched his political career. So obviously when most people think of Winston Churchill, they think of World War II, maybe World War I. They think of the overweight guy, bald, chomping on a cigar. But this is a completely different Winston Churchill. At the beginning of his life, he's young, he's thin, he's incredibly adventurous, and he's launched himself into another war.
And so remind some of us, because we were sleeping when they were teaching us about the Boer War. Why was that so important?
So this takes place in South Africa. The Boers were largely sort of Dutch, mostly Dutch immigrants who had been in South Africa for many generations, for centuries, and just wanted to be left alone. So they're incredibly religious. They're very racist, and they just wanted to be left alone. They didn't like the British Empire because the British Empire tried to control them, and they had also abolished slavery. And so they weren't that interested, the British weren't, until they discovered gold and then diamonds in the Transvaal, which was one of the Boer republics. And so then the British Empire was very interested, and it just kept heightening and heightening until war finally broke out.
What years are we talking about?
So this is 1899. So it's on the cusp of the new century.
Gotcha. And so why a century and 15 years later, Candice Millard, did you pick this as your next topic?
So I had heard this story literally 25 years ago, and I was stunned by it because I was like, Winston Churchill was a prisoner of war when he was 24 years old, and he had escaped by himself, and I was just stunned by it, and it just kind of stayed in the back of my mind, and I worked at National Geographic, and I wrote about Theodore Roosevelt, I wrote about James Garfield, and when I finished my James Garfield story, I just remembered it again, and I started to look into it, and not only is this the beginning of Winston Churchill's career, not only is this an incredible adventure and survival story, but this is also the beginning of modern warfare. It's some of the first guerrilla fighting. It's the first concentration camps. It's among the first time when they didn't wear their red coats, their famous red coats. So everything's changing, and it really prepared the British Army for World War I.
Did Winston Churchill go down? Did he sign up and sort of join the fight because he wanted to save the motherland? I mean, how did he end up down there?
So as part of it, so he's 24 years old. He's already been in 3 different wars on 3 different continents. He's written 3 books. He's run for Parliament and lost. And so he wanted a way to kickstart his political career. And he thought that the best way to do that was through a war, to become a hero, to become a household name. And so he's not in the military anymore. He had left the military to run for Parliament. But he's an incredible writer. He ended up winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. This whole life, he supported himself through writing. And so he had been a journalist in all these other wars as well as fighting. So he went there as a journalist, but unfortunately, just like a month after he got to South Africa, he was captured in this attack on an armored train.
It sounds like Winston Churchill was a megalomaniac in a sense.
Well, does that surprise you? I mean, he, like many famous, incredibly effective leaders, he had a huge ego, but he was also the real deal. He was genuinely brave. He was genuinely ambitious, and he did love the British Empire. He felt he was, absolutely an unabashed imperialist, and he felt very strongly that the British Empire was a force for good in the world.
The book is called Hero of the Empire, The Boer War, A Daring Escape and the Making of Winston Churchill. He's 24 years old when he goes down there?
That's right. Yeah, he turns 25 in this POW camp.
And how long is he in the POW camp for?
So he's only there for about a month. He's desperate to escape. As soon as he's captured, he's furious. He was in an armored train that was attacked. He's He's the youngest guy on the train. He's one of the only people not in the military. But, of course, he immediately took advantage of the situation, and he took over the defense of the train. And so he saved a lot of people's lives, and the people who made it out said it was thanks to Winston Churchill. But he was captured, put in this POW camp in Pretoria. He's determined to escape, and he finally does. But the problem is that the men who had planned the escape and reluctantly let him go along were trapped inside. They couldn't get out, and he did. And they had all the supplies. So here he is facing almost 300 miles of enemy territory by himself. He didn't have a map. He didn't have a compass. He didn't have food. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't speak the language. And he knew that the Boers, as soon as they found out he had escaped, would be enraged and determined to catch him. And if they caught him, there was a very real risk that they would kill him.
Did he run across Gandhi during these travels?
He did. Strangely, he did. They were, and later, so after he escapes, he makes it out. He says, "I want to fight now," and so he actually becomes part of a regiment, and he fights in a famous battle called Spion Kop. And Mahatma Gandhi was there as well. People forget that Gandhi spent a lot of time in South Africa, and that's where he developed his ideas of nonviolent resistance. And so Gandhi had formed a stretcher corps. So they're these stretcher bearers, and he was on the same battlefields as Winston Churchill.
Rudyard Kipling also? I mean, this is like a Forrest Gump movie in a sense.
Yeah, Rudyard Kipling also, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was there as well.
So when he gets out and the Boer War is over with, that then propels Winston Churchill to fame and fortune?
Yeah, so he becomes a national hero. So right before he escaped, the British had what they call Black Week, where they lost huge battle after huge battle because the Boers, they thought these are, bumpkins. They don't know what they're doing. That we're the British Army. Everybody's afraid of us. But the Boers were actually very, very sophisticated fighters. They had better weapons than the British, and obviously they knew the South African felt much better than the British. So they were winning the war at that point. The British public back home was astonished and horrified that this was happening. And here comes Winston Churchill, young Winston Churchill, who's the son of a lord, the son of a former chancellor of the Exchequer, and he's escaped, and he's made it, and he's made a fool of the Boers, and it really rallied the public morale, and so it made him famous. It did exactly what he had hoped to do. And so, as I said, he had run for Parliament before the war and lost. He immediately goes home, runs again, and wins his first seat in Parliament.
Candice Millard, our guest, best-selling, national bestseller. The new book is called Hero of the Empire, The Boer War, A Daring Escape and the Making of Winston Churchill. How much did you use the National Churchill Museum in Fulton for your research?
I didn't use it a lot because that mostly focuses on, obviously, World War II and later in his life. I have gone there many times. It's a fantastic place, and we're so lucky. I live in Kansas City, so not too far away, and we're so lucky to have it. It's really a brilliant place. But most of my research was done at the Churchill Archives in Cambridge, and then I went to South Africa. And the incredible thing about the story is that you can still go. I went to where he was captured. I went to the POW camp. The same building is still there. It's now a public library. I stood in there's a hatch in the floor, a trap door in the floor of the room where Churchill was kept, where they thought about digging their way out. He hid for 3 days in a coal mine shaft with white rats. I went to where that colliery had been. I went into what's now Mozambique, was in Portuguese East Africa, to the British consulate where Churchill finally came to freedom. The same building, so it was just this incredible adventure for me as well.
So you went to the same room. Is there a plaque or anything on the door, or did you say, "Oh, by the way, Winston Churchill was held captive in this room here"?
They're very well aware that he was there, but it's like I said, it's a public library now. One of the really cool things that they have is on in another room so this is an officers' prison. And these officers were incredibly well-trained cartographers, when they're in military school. And they let them draw a map of South Africa on the wall, charting the course of the war. And that map is still there. They just kind of have a plexiglass over it. But Yeah, they're very well aware of what Winston Churchill did there in 1899.
The book is called Hero of the Empire, The Boer War, A Daring Escape and the Making of Winston Churchill. I got to ask, Candice, first of all, The Destiny of the Republic, your last book, where is that in the movie world? Is that being turned into a movie?
Well, it's been made into a documentary. So PBS, American Experience, made a beautiful sort of docudrama where they had partly, actors recreating it and partly footage, and that was beautifully done. But it hasn't been optioned. My first book, The River of Doubt, has been optioned. We'll see if it ever is made into a movie. I don't know.
And then what about this?
There's been some discussion. I have an agent in LA, and there's been some interest, and every once in a while she'll check in with me, but I just kind of do my little thing in the book world and let them tell me what's happening.
Candice Millard, if you could ask Winston Churchill a question after spending years with him writing this book, what would the question be?
What next adventure would you like to have? He lived to be 90 years old, which is so incredible considering not just, the fact that he was always drinking and smoking throughout his life. He started with the cigars when he was 23 and the whiskey when he was 24, but he was always throwing himself into the next adventure. He just never stopped. And so I would love to know if he had another 10 years, let's say he got to live to be 100 years old, what would his next adventure be?
Did he die penniless, or is that a rumor?
Well, he was struggling. I mean, he had to, so he has a, Chartwell. He had a beautiful country home, Chartwell, and friends had to come in and help him save it. It's true. I don't know if he was penniless, but he was struggling because, so he was born into the highest ranks of British aristocracy. He was born at Blenheim Palace, this immense, incredibly lavish palace. But, like a lot of those places, they were suffering. They were really struggling for money. And so, like I said, he had to support himself. I mean, you don't make any money in politics, certainly in England. He had to support himself with his writing.
So if he doesn't make it out of there, and he doesn't get back, and he doesn't survive the rat room, right? He doesn't stand up to Germany during the Battle of Britain. He doesn't sort of get Americans into World War II. The whole world changes if he doesn't get out of there.
I think so. I mean, you'd like to think somebody else would step up to the plate, but he was one of these once in a generation figures. You just don't see many Winston Churchills. He was extraordinary. He was far from perfect, but he was absolutely what his country and what our country and much of the world needed during World War II. So we're lucky we made it out alive.
Yeah, Candice, what is your next adventure?
So my next adventure, I'm going back to Africa and back to England. I'm writing about the discovery of the source of the Nile, which is the Holy Grail, during the Victorian age. But it's also a story of friendship between these two men and the betrayal of that friendship. Candice
Millard, you are always welcome here. You are a great writer, a great storyteller, and you always find these stories that really are lost to history, but certainly make it relevant for the 21st century. So good luck with this one. Hero of the Empire, The Boer War, A Daring Escape and the Making of Winston Churchill. Candice Millard, thanks for checking in.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
You got it. Candice Millard, she's a national bestseller and a wonderful storyteller. And if you're looking for a good book to sink your teeth into, Hero of the Empire, The Boer War, A Daring Escape, and the Making of Winston Churchill. That's one of these where, you want someone to say, give me a good book. And you're like, what? I would never